We are now recording this. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to set up our instance of Debian to allow network communications from a remote, if you will, connection. Alright? A lot of the things that we did in our last class when we were setting up DVWA, we will do again. Okay? We will create a database. We will give access to that database. So we're going to talk about what's going on at the bottom of page 3 of this handout. And one of the accesses we are going to grant is no longer a localhost connection, but a wildcard connection, so it can be connected from anywhere. So this is what we need to take into account. If you're going to give somebody access to your database and it's not a localhost connection, you need to do two things. First, set privileges to allow for it, and second, you need to modify your database settings, your database connection file, for your server connections. It's set to only allow localhost. We're going to modify that to allow anyone to connect. Again, there's some firewall things you can do to mitigate against this. This is, again, that balance between setting up a development environment and a production environment. This is allowing some development while keeping an eye towards production, specifically not rolling phpMyAdmin out into a production server. Any questions? Does that make sense? Sorry. Right. So, let's take a look. As always, I do have Debian running, but to make things easier, I usually use PuTTY so that you can see my font. If you're not already logged in as root, you need to become root because you are changing server configurations. I usually use Vi, so if you see me starting to type Vi, that's why, but unless you know how to use Vi, I advise avoiding it. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you or not. If you want a job as a systems person or as a pen tester or something like that, and you've got some old school geeks sitting across an interview table from you, or some old school geeks like me watching you do your work, fire up Vi and use it properly. You will impress them. All right? It's an old school skill that few people have, and it speaks to a seriousness that you may or may not benefit from. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but it is sometimes nice to do. So, etc mysql mariadb.conf or mariadb.conf.d, and then there's going to be a 50-server.cnf file. And of course, we want to open it up with nano. And if you want to see the command, where do I have the command? Here's the command. The command that we're running is the nano command as root, and we're doing a modification of the server config file in the etc mysql mariadb.conf.d directory. Okay? And tab is your friend, as always. Alright? And when we take a look, this is just a basic settings file. Now mine is colored because of a couple of things, but I have one mistake, and I'm just going to show you right away. You're going to see it right away. I'm going to introduce an error. If you've typed in what I typed in, oh no, I became root, so I shouldn't have this problem. Yeah, never mind. I thought I hadn't become root, or I hadn't typed in sudo command, but I had become root, I'm pretty sure, so I should be okay. If you try and edit this file and you get a permission denied error, exit out without saving, become root, and then make the modification again. But at the end of the day, in the very first block of code, there is a bind address parameter, and you just need to change that to 0000. It was before 127.0.0.1, and we need to change that to allow it to connect from anywhere. We don't need to change the port settings. If you wanted to change the port to do a little bit of security through obscurity, that's an option as well. Control O to write out the file. It says it wrote 133 lines, awesome. Control X. Again, how did I do that? Well, first off, I used the tab key. Nano /etc/my tab, MAR tab, O tab, 50 tab. Oh, I need to specify the S server because there's a 50 client as well. All right, so tab is your friend, and use the tab key on your keyboard as much as possible. Not only is it easier, it avoids making mistakes. Enter. I scrolled down. It's basically in the first little block of settings. I think I went too far. There it is. There's a default setting of 127.0.0.1. Change that bind address setting to 0000. Control O to exit. Control O to save. Control X to exit. I apologize for all the misspeaking that I'm doing. Are there any questions? Is my mumbling and misspeaking making sense at all? All right. I think you're being generous, so I will thank you for that. Okay, so I've modified my server to allow remote connections, but as I said, that's only half the equation. You not only need to set up the server, you also need to set up permissions. And before we go any further, anytime you change a server setting, you have to do one of two things. Either restart the machine, which is something you really don't need to do in the Unix world. And to be honest, you rarely see this problem in the Windows world anymore either. It's always a good thing to do a restart if you can, because it ensures that the system comes up properly if there's a reset in the future with these new settings. We don't need to do that. It was a relatively simple server reset, and I have the commands here that you can use to restart. And this is the system control restart command. I'm going to show you that, and I'm also going to show you the service, and then the service name, and then the parameter that you pass with it. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways. This one works if this is what the documentation says. Use what the documentation says, but at the end of the day you need to restart. So it's system control restart, and then you need to specify the service, mysql.service, like that. We need to restart both MySQL and Mariah. All right, so that's how you can type it in, and that's what the instructions say when you take a look at changing the settings. Okay, that's never what I do. I always do service like this, and I've already done MySQL, so I'm going to do MariahDB, and it finds it, and then restart. Both are fine. I've never had any problems. If you are unsure, always do what the documentation recommends. Okay? At the end of the day, I've set my server to a new configuration. I've restarted the service, so I've forced it to load it. I fired it up. It didn't look like it threw any errors when it restarted the server process. I'm probably good to go to the second part of this settings. I could modify the DVWA database that we created in our last class and add the ability to have a remote connection to one of the users, or create a new user to give remote connection. We're not going to do that. We're going to create a new database today, and we're going to give access to it, and I want you to keep this in mind going forward. Okay, so I'm going to do mysql-u root. I'm going to log in, and we're going to create database. I can't remember if I called this one blog or not in the documentation. I think I called it blog. Yeah, we're going to create a database called blog. All right, and then once we have that database created, we're going to create a couple of users. Okay, now because I'm using PuTTY, I can copy paste. It's one of the true beauties of PuTTY is that you have the ability to copy paste. These are both separate lines, and they are both terminated with semicolons. Everything needs to be terminated with a semicolon. That delineates one command from another. Okay, as always, we should always verify that the database was created. There it is there. Okay, now I'm going to create a couple of users. One that's going to be a local host user. Ideally, or typically I should say, that local host user is going to be the one that the application uses to access the database. If it becomes compromised, really at the end of the day, they only have localhost access. However, I am going to also create a blog admin account, and this blog admin account gets access anywhere, and that's what the percent is. If you remember from your DBMS 1 and 2, the percent is a wildcard, so it can connect from anywhere. Please type in both of these commands into your MySQL command line tool. All right. Please note what easy that was to do with PuTTY. One of the really nice things about PuTTY, there's two things that I enjoy about PuTTY. One, I can change the font size for my lectures, and two, I can copy and paste into PuTTY and out of PuTTY. It's really quite a nice tool that way. I'll give you a minute to check, and I'm just going to check my print. Okay, I'm assuming everybody has that typed in now. If not, let me know, or if you're having problems, let me know. Okay. As always, when we set up new permissions, what did we see last time when we were setting up new permissions? What should we do next? Flush privileges, exactly. So we're going to go back to our MySQL flush privileges, semicolon, and then we know that those settings have taken place. And they'll probably take place in pretty reasonable time, but this removes that mysterious variable of when exactly are those permissions going to take place. Anytime I do a grant statement or I modify something with regards to permissions, the next thing I do in MySQL is flush privileges. That's my workflow. You, of course, do you. What's next? Okay, so we've got that done. Oh, I forgot to tell you to do something. I'm sorry. If you take a look at the document, I mentioned here that there is a site, and it's you can go directly to that site. You can click on the link in the document. Or you can simply open up your browser. Where's the browser? Let's use this browser. And just simply Google SQL Manager. Alright? You can just Google SQL Manager, or you can simply go to the website sqlmanager.net. Because what we need to do is, because, oh, they're having a sale. Huzzah. Because we are not using phpMyAdmin, because we are wanting to manage our database, and because, I don't know about you, but I hate doing everything through the terminal. It seems unwieldy to me, and while I can copy and paste, I prefer to have a tool that gives me an easier representation of the data. Especially when we start populating our database with data. Our tables start getting full up with records, and it's nice to have some kind of a graphical front end. And then there's this thing, it's less now, but back in the day, and this is why I've come across SQL Manager. Back in the day, it was rare that you would have both a really good database front end and a database back end from one company. I mean, you take a look at stuff like Oracle or Postgres. They have great database engines, not so good on the front end, right? Oracle's getting better and they have some tools, but you have to install extra tools to manage it. Same with Postgres. Postgres has a front end tool, not so good on, has a front end tool, but it's not as good as Postgres database is. Same with MySQL. And to be honest, you can use the MySQL admin tool. I can't recall what it's called. Sorry, Workbench. You can always get the MySQL Workbench. I don't care. You can use these tools. If you've used Workbench in the past and you're happy with it, go to town. The settings we're making will work with this as well. I've liked SQL Manager. You can buy it, but this is really important. On the bottom of the home page, or if you follow the link in the document, there's a free database tools page. Again, I went to the home page of sqlmanager.net. I scrolled down to the bottom of that home page, and there is almost always a free database tools link at the bottom of that page, where you can download database front ends to most of the popular database engines out there. All right. The one for SQL Server, I don't know. I think the front end for SQL Server isn't too bad. The one for Postgres is nice. Oracle has some nice front end tools. I don't think that is quite as necessary. And frankly, I haven't played with Interbase or Freebird, and I haven't played with DB2 in a long time. Okay, I do really like the front end for MySQL. It's quite nice. And again, you can use this. You can use the Workbench, or you can install Microsoft Access and create an ODBC connection to your database. That works as well. I don't care, as long as you download and install some kind of database front end. My recommendation is from this. So go to the free page, find the SQL Manager from MySQL, download and install. And at some point, you will have SQL Manager Lite for MySQL. Go ahead and do that. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Once you have that, it will pop up saying, hey, do you want to try the full version? I encourage you to say no, because once you say yes, you are stuck with that for 30 days, and then you can never downgrade to the Lite version. Even uninstalling is difficult. I think it requires a lot more work in the registry than I'm prepared to do. So if you ever say yes, you might have to buy it or get another tool, because it stops working after that 30-day trial period. I always say no. You only have to say no for the first 30 days, and then it stops nagging you. And then it just launches like it did for me, the free version. There is also a tips pop-up that happens when you first power it on as well. That's up to you whether you enable or disable that. You do you. Okay? I'll give you a couple of minutes to get this set up. Let me know if you're having any problems. By show of hands or typing in the chat window, has anybody failed to set up SQL Manager Lite? Please be honest. No questions? Alrighty. So, we have, by way of review, set up a database, given remote access to one of the users to that database, and we have reconfigured our database to allow remote connections, and we restarted the services. At this point, we should be able to test a connection. For this to work, you have to know your settings. Okay? I don't know what mine are. I think they're 192. Let's just verify. No, it's not generic, it's password. Yeah, my IP address is C193, so it's good that I verified. If you're inside of this tool, you can exit out with the /Q. That allows you to exit out, and I could have just as easily verified my IP address here. I probably should have done that. Apologies. So here's my IP address, 192.168.56.193. Yours is likely 101, maybe 102 or 103, depending on how much you use your VirtualBox. As you can see, I use mine a lot. So I need to make a new connection. I am not creating a database. My database has been created. Okay? I am connecting to a database. Actually, I'm registering a database so I can connect to it. Once I have it registered, then I can connect to it. So we need to actually register a database so that we can connect to it. Okay? Specify the IP address of your environment. Specify the username and the password that you used. Okay? So for me, I created blog admin, and then the password was password. I think that's fine. So the IP address, I don't know how well you can see that, but in the registered database wizard, you want to specify the IP address of the server. It defaults to localhost, but we're not using localhost. We're using the database IP address, the database server IP address, which in this case is, of course, our Debian address. Specify the name we created, specify the password, and click on Next. And this is the test. When you click on Next and you select the drop down for the database name, if it says can't find, or it throws an error, or it doesn't list the databases, you have something wrong in your configuration. Either you didn't restart your service, I should say, or you didn't set the IP address for your bind address properly, or you did not set the privileges correctly, or they have not been flushed as yet. Okay? It's hard to say which it is because all of these pieces need to work together for this to work. All right? So you select from the drop-down list and you specify the database that you just defined. In my case, it's blog, and then that gives you a graphical interface into your database. You're still not connected, all right? You have to right-click and connect, or just double-click on it, and then the icon turns from grayed out to that gold color, and you actually see the different types of objects you can have inside that database. This is what you want to see. You have a list of object types related to a specific database. You have everything set up properly. Is anybody not at this point, and are there any questions? All right, let's move on. Now that we have our database created, actually I think I created two databases. I'm going to show you one more thing. I'm going to go back into MySQL, and that's, I think, where I was mistaken. I shouldn't have kicked myself out. I'm going to go back into MySQL as root, and I'm going to create another database. Alright? So now I have a database called MyDB. I have set aside the Word document at this time. I'm going to set this aside for now, but I want you to work through on this on your own time tomorrow. If you have questions, I should be available to answer any questions, but I want you to work through this on your own. Okay? We're going to go to the PowerPoint where we start talking about some of the tools that we create here. And this is just very introductory, and we're going to talk about creating a table, creating a database, creating a table of users, adding a user to it, and then starting to try and hack it. Okay? If you want in Learn in this shell, if you take a look, there is also a PHP login zip file, and there's also a setup file. The setup file, if you were to take a look at that, has a bunch of SQL commands that you can use. Alright? Obviously this is table members, whereas the PowerPoint slide talks about the table users. There is also a PHP login zip file, and when you download that, you see that this also has, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, you can play with that on your own later. That's part of the lecture we're going to have next week. That's our next lecture. It is the database security file that I wanted you to download. So take a look at database security, click on download, and open with Windows Explorer, or open it up. This is the one that has the files that match a little bit better what's happening with the PowerPoint lectures. Later on you will see that there is a couple of forms here. They are contained in this file. There are also a couple of processing scripts that are contained in this file as well. And there is, most importantly, a notes file which allows us to go through and create these individual records. Alright? So I'm going to create the database MyDB. There is a typo. It uses a smart quote. So fix that. If you take a look at the lecture notes, we're back up here. There is a typo in one of them. Right here. The MyDB. So that's not supposed to be a smart quote, and it kind of got moved through. So I can, at this point, create another access to my MyDB database. Flush the privileges, and then I can, in theory, connect at this point. But I want you to draw your attention. Alright? I'm going to try and register a fourth database. Should be fine. I need to change the username. Then I can select MyDB. Okay? So, I was unsure if it was 3 databases or 5, or maybe it's 4 that I'm allowed to make, but I think there's a very early limit into the number of databases you can register, and it's not even connections. It's the number of databases you can register with this free version. If you need to manage more databases than that, then again, you need to have another solution, or you need to buy a licensed copy of this software. But now that I've got the My Database, I can go into that. Okay. The problem is that I am connected to 2 different databases. So when I start opening up some of the tools, like the SQL editor, by hitting F12, you have to make sure you're connected to the right database, and this is why I'm doing this. There are different databases that you might be connected to. You have to ensure that you specify the correct database. For me, the easiest way to do that is to disconnect from any databases I don't want to work on, and only in this tool connect to the single database I want to work with. Okay? And you're going to find it's now a lot easier to use this tool, because you can now copy and paste from the text file, from the notes.txt file that is in that zip. So we can create our table users and execute by hitting the Go Gadget green button. And it doesn't look like anything's happened. When I hit execute, it says okay, nothing to report. Doesn't look like anything's happened along the side, but what you need to do is right click and refresh the database, and then it'll show a new object in the tables area. And this object is called users. And when you double click on it, it actually shows you both the schema, and there's a tab across the top to show data there is no data yet. Let us put some data into our table. We're going to copy the next 3 lines, and we're going to go back to our editor. We can either comment all that out, quick code, toggle comment, and go down to the end, or if I'm done with it, just delete the old, paste the new, go gadget. It says 3 rows. Again, I look at users. Doesn't look like anything's happened, but I do have the refresh object button, and then it'll show my 3 new records. Any questions on that? Alrighty, this is where we start getting into examples of SQL injections. I'm going to take a look at this first line of code here, and when I go back to my editor and I make that my code, it's going to give me a result set. Alright, so when I hit execute or F9, it's going to give me a result set, and I can take a look at the grid here, or I can take a look at a form view of the result set. But it gives me a count of 1, basically saying that there is somebody in the database in the users table where the username is John and the password is Doe. And that is unfortunately a very common way that we see people setting up logins in places like Stack Overflow. This is not, in my opinion, a good way of doing a login script, and I'll show you why. It presupposes that, and we'll go back to the lecture notes, that somebody has typed in, rather than logging in properly, right? They've typed in the username John and they've typed in Doe. Or what they might do is try and bypass that by doing what's called an SQL injection. And let's take a look at those right now. There are a couple of main SQL injection statements that we can look at. One of the most common ones, however, is simply this string here. Okay, so this works a little bit better for me. So normally what you see is a statement like this, where they tried to supply some form data for username John and password Doe. But let's say that they substitute something for the username Joe. Rather than specifying the correct username and password, they're going to try and supply something different. They're going to supply as a password closing tick or 1 is equal to 1, and either a hash or double dash, depending on the DBMS engine in place. I believe the ANSI SQL standard for database comments is still the double dash. I don't think that's changed, but certain DBMS engines use different comments, and in our case MySQL and Mariah both use the hash for a comment, and a lot of people try the hash first, but try one or try the other and see if either one works. What this does is that the comment comments out the rest of the line, and that's important. These double dash, or in our case these hashes, comment out the rest of the line. Sorry about that. And that's SQL Injection 101. Okay, so now when we do this, and that becomes our command that gets parsed,